Okay, hello again. So in the next video here, what I want to do is go through movements for versus a shift in the aggregate demand curve. So first, let me once again draw. The IS curve and the MP curve. And the aggregate demand curve. And label the axis. So we've got this IS curve, downward sloping, MP curve, upward sloping. Show what the Fed does for inflation. And we've got downward sloping aggregate demand curve with inflation on the vertical axis. Now we know that a change of inflation causes a movement along the aggregate demand curve. Anything else that affects output is shown by a shift in the curve. So if the IS curve shifts to the right, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. IS curve shifts to the left, aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. MP curve shifts to the right or downward and right, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. MP curve shifts to the left or down, up and to the left, and aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. So for example, consumption increases or investment increases or government spending increases or taxes decrease, all of those would shift the IS curve to the right and then shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So the aggregate demand curve can shift to the right because of the IS curve shifting or because of the MP curve shifting. Now, if the MP curve shifts to the right, that would be because of R bar. So if R bar falls, let me actually, that would make the MP shift down and to the right. Which would then make the aggregate demand curve shift to the right. And up above that, consumption goes up, or government spending goes up, or taxes go up. That's going to make the IS curve shift to the right. Which would then make the aggregate demand curve shift to the right. So let's draw this out. So let's say we're at 2% inflation. And go over here to the demand curve, and output is lower than potential. We'll call it Y sub L for low. And at a 2% inflation rate, the Fed is setting the interest rate, real interest rate at, we'll just call it R. And at that interest rate R, the IS curve brings us down to an output that's low. So we're at equilibrium here, but output's below potential. It's a short run equilibrium because we know in the long run equilibrium, we're going to be at potential. Now, what if the Fed was to do something about this? Say, well, you know, people are unemployed. Our dual mandate says we've got to stimulate the economy and lower interest rates. So that would mean moving the MP curve down, lowering R bar, so that we have something like this. We're just going to move it down, start lowering interest rates because output's too low. We'll call that MP prime. That means we have a new interest rate here, new real interest rate that's lower than before. And at that lower interest rate here in green, that will increase investment spending and push us up to Y. And that means that still have a 2% inflation rate. The aggregate demand curve has to be shifted out so that new output here is the output Y there in green. So what I want you to remember here is that when the Fed lowers R bar, or lowers it in response, lowers interest rates in response to stimulate the economy or because of the economy, it shifts that MP curve up or down, which shifts the aggregate demand curve up or down. If the Fed is changing interest rates because of inflation, that's inside the model. And it doesn't shift the aggregate demand curve. It only causes a movement along the aggregate demand curve. Now you can see in this model also that this uses the traditional channel of how monetary policy works in the monetary policy transmission mechanism. The money supply changes, affects nominal interest rates, it affects the real interest rates. Then the real interest rate affects investment spending on the IS curve, which affects aggregate demand. Now you can see here we lowered R bar. Now you can imagine here, okay, what happens if R bar then gets down to 0? Now it might be difficult. R bar, a real interest rate, can go below 0 a little bit. So if we could somehow get the real interest rate to go below 0, then we could continue this MP curve all the way down. What if the IS curve is very steep, meaning that changes of interest rate don't affect investment spending very much? Well, then monetary policy wouldn't be as effective. The aggregate demand curve might not move out as much. So for example, one of the ways that changing interest rates might affect the economy is if the lower interest rates get people to go out and buy a home. But what if home prices are falling? What if every year for the last 3 or 4 years, home prices are falling? People are thinking, well, they've been falling the last few years. They're probably going to keep falling. I don't want to buy a house. So it doesn't matter if interest rates fall. Still not going to buy a house if I think that they're going to drop next year. So in that case, lowering interest rates wouldn't stimulate any investment spending and wouldn't stimulate aggregate demand. Now, another issue in this model is it really doesn't distinguish between short-term interest rates and long-term interest rates. And that's probably fine because it would be too confusing. However, if you look through the model carefully and read through it, you'll realize generally they're talking about short-term interest rates, because that's the interest rate that the central bank can change the easiest. It's much easier for them to change a short-term interest rate than a long-term interest rate. Short-term interest rates, remember, they're a big fish in a small pond. Long-term interest rates, they tend to be a little fish in a big pond. But still, this model gives some insights into what's going on into the economy. Okay, so next let's go through an example. We'll go through an example where the economy is just fine. We're at potential, we're at full employment, but there's some sort of drop in confidence, like what Keynes would say, a drop in animal spirits. How does this affect the economy? Well, remember, investment spending in our model is I bar plus some function of the interest rate, where I bar is autonomous investment and essentially includes everything else that would affect investment other than the interest rate. So animal spirits falls, then I bar is going to fall, which means that investment falls, which means that output's going to fall. Let's take a look at it here on the graphs. So I'm going to draw the IS curve. And the LM curve. And the aggregate demand curve once again. And we have this downward sloping IS curve, upward sloping MP curve, and downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Okay, and we're at potential. So that means we got to be right here where aggregate demand intersects the long run aggregate supply curve. And the short run has to go through that point too. We're in long run equilibrium, we've got to be in short run equilibrium. So just to make things simple, I'm going to say that this is the short run aggregate supply curve, and it's just flat, meaning inflation doesn't change very easily. And we'll call that inflation rate pi 0. And at an inflation rate of pi 0, we can figure out what the real interest rate is by the Fed. We'll call that R0. And at R0, this is the amount of output, and it will be potential output. So animal spirits fall. I bar falls. That means this IS curve is going to shift to the left. And we'll have a lower income, lower equilibrium income, call this YL. And the aggregate demand curve shifts here to the left, call it AD prime, and we get a new equilibrium. We'll have this short run equilibrium at income Y sub L, which is lower than potential. So what's going on here is that investment has fallen and savings has to equal investment in the short run. So that means that savings is going to have to fall, right? Since savings equals investment. In order for savings to fall, we have to have Y fall, because savings are dependent on what Y is. Now, at this point, the Federal Reserve could step in and do something about it. But if they don't, what's going to happen here? I'll put that in blue. In the long run, We know we're going to be at potential full employment, whether the Fed does anything or not. The only difference is how long it's going to take. So I'll put here in blue, this will be the long run equilibrium. From a fall in animal spirits. Provided that it doesn't, animal spirits don't increase and go back right up to where they were again. If they went back up to where they were, then the aggregate demand curve would go back to its old spot. But here we're talking about animal spirits falling and staying down. So eventually we're going to get to that long run equilibrium. And it may take a while because the inflation rate has to fall. And we'll call that new inflation rate pi 1, where pi 1 is a lower inflation rate than before. And at pi 1, a lower inflation rate, now the Fed will lower interest rates. That's what the MP curve says. Inflation falls, the Fed will lower interest rates. They'll lower the interest rate, real interest rate, we'll call it R1. And at R1, that will bring us back to potential. So in the long run, inflation falls. And the real rate of interest has fallen too. R has fallen too. There's been no exogenous changes in R bar or in lambda, but the economy is able to go back to potential by itself at just a lower level of inflation and a lower real interest rate. Okay, so that's the end of this video. Let's just go back and go through here. What we did, we went through to figure out how the natural rate of inflation is determined, which is also the neutral rate. And the Fed can change that rate with their policy stances. And they tend to do that by using the interest rates. So they lower the interest rate lower than that natural rate, and it would be an easy monetary policy which is going to stimulate the economy, or they just raise that rate above that natural rate, which would then contract the economy and lower inflation over time. Their usual choice of the policy instrument is exactly that, changing interest rates instead of the money supply. This MP curve reflects how the Fed acts. It reflects that they change interest rates when inflation changes by a movement along the MP curve, and they change interest rates because of output in the economy, which is reflected by a shift in the MP curve. We put that MP curve together with the IS curve, and we get a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And any of these shifts in the MP curve or the IS curve causes a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Now, the only thing that's going to cause a shift in the MP curve is because of the Fed lowering interest rates because of the economy, not because of inflation. So remember, on the aggregate demand curve, a change in inflation just causes a movement on the aggregate demand curve. It doesn't cause a shift. So what I'd like you to do next is the practice handout. And in the next video, I'll go over the practice handout.